For 3 years.
I was the pulse of a dying machine, the invisible hand keeping a multi-million-dollar startup from imploding. When I finally mustered the courage to ask for the equity I had been promised, the CEO sent a laughing emoji and a message saying I was just a contractor. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply smiled, finalized my exit for the morning of their massive IPO,
Sat back to watch their entire empire turn to ash.
grab your popcorn, because this is how you dismantle a house of cards from the inside. I'm Damien, and for 3 years,
You.
I was the guy behind the How to Exploitor developer startup. It started with a Craigslist ad that looked like a cry for help. Need coder 5 developers had quit before me, a red flag I should have seen from space.
But I was 24, broke, and drowning in students' loans.
I walked into a garage filled with 3 guys from Stanford who had expensive haircuts and zero common sense. Owen was the CEO,
Vicken.
a walking Instagram filter who thought disrupting vertical integration was a personality trait. Vicky, the CFO, had a shark-like smile and the unique ability to laugh at Owen's unfunny jokes precisely 2 seconds after he spoke.
Brett.
The CTO, who once asked me with a straight face if Python was a type of snake. I looked at their code and felt my soul leave my body. It was a nightmare of mismatched frameworks.
Variables named thingy final for real.
And comments like IDK, this seems to work, don't touch it. The site crashed every time someone sneezed. It was a car crash in slow motion, yet for some reason,
I decided to be the one to pull them out of the wreckage.
I spent the night fixing the database queries that were causing their server timeouts. By morning, Owen was hugging me, Vicky was crying, and Brett looked at me like it just invented fire. They offered me $55,000 on the spot. I should have asked for equity in writing. I should have demanded a contract.
Fusion.
But when you're staring at a bank balance of negative dollars, 55 grand sounds like a fortune. I took the job. My girlfriend, Kristen,
Furthermance was thrilled at first.
because she loved telling her friends her boyfriend worked at a promising startup. My best friend, Zach, a blow-color welder, who knew how the world worked, just shook his head.
Promising you.
A piece of someone else's pizza, Damien, he told me over a beer. Don't eat it. I ignored him, because I was young and foolish. The first year was a blur of heroics.
Fusion.
I saved their series a pitch from a total server meltdown, and for that, Owen took us to a steakhouse and gave a speech about my invaluable contribution. But that was the peak. Soon, 40-hour weeks became 80-hour grinds.
Bing.
I was deploying patches at 3 in the morning, while Owen was posting stories from a yoga retreat in Bali. I was debugging payment gateways on Christmas while they were at Coachella.
My health deteriorated.
My diet consisted of whatever the guy at the local 7-Eleven had on the shelves. His name was Lewis, the only person who seemed to care that I looked like a ghost.
My apartment became a place to store my clothes.
Kristen grew to despise the sight of my laptop. You care more about that code than you do about us, she said, storming out after I had to leave our anniversary dinner to fix a database lock. She was right, but I was blinded by the promises. Just wait for the Series B, Owen would say. Legal is handling the paperwork.
Vicky would lie.
Then came the day. I finally stood up for myself. I had been doing the job of 3 engineers for 3 years, and I was tired of the empty promises. I walked into Owen's office,
ready to collect what I had earned.
I showed him my contributions, the code I built, the fires I put out. I asked for my equity. Owen didn't even look up from his phone. He sent a text to my Slack.
Emoji.
And the words, Damien, you're just a contractor, get back to work. In that moment, everything snapped into focus. I realized I wasn't an employee. I was a hostage.
Fate.
I spent the next 3 months planning my departure, but I didn't just quit. I made sure that when I left, I took the entire foundation of the company with me.
Houston.
They had built their entire infrastructure on a private repository that I had quietly optimized for my own proprietary workflows. The night before the IPO, the office was buzzing. They were all popping champagne,
preparing for their big payout.
I sat at my desk, finished my final deploy, and then I executed a script that triggered a massive, irreversible data migration. I didn't delete anything,
Thank you.
but I completely restricted access to the core database keys and reorganized the entire directory structure into an encrypted labyrinth only I could navigate. I set an autoplay for the company email address. Then,
You.
I walked out the front door. By the time the IPO started, the site was offline. The dashboard was a blank screen. The investors were panicking, and the board members were screaming for answers.
Thinged. Owen called me 40 times in an hour.
I finally picked up. Damien, the site is down. What the hell is happening? He shrieked. I just listened to the sound of his panic for a moment. Oh, the site? I asked.
You knowin'. Calm as the ocean.
I think you're confused. I'm just a contractor and my contract ended this morning. I hung up, blocked his number, and turned my phone off. 3 hours later, the IPO was canceled.
Vroom did.
The company's valuation dropped to zero before the market even closed. I didn't need the money. They promised me. I had already built a freelance consulting firm during my spare time,
Ticked.
and I was already working with a client that valued my skill. 2 weeks later, I ran into Zach at his shop. He didn't have to ask. He just handed me a beer, clinked his bottle against mine, and said, I told you,
Vic.
man, don't eat the pizza. Justice isn't always about winning in court. Sometimes, justice is just watching the people who thought they were smarter than you realize exactly how much they needed you.
Theme.
I walked away with my integrity, my freedom, and the satisfaction of knowing that I was the one who pulled the plug. And honestly, I've never slept better. The screen glowed with the cold,
Eat.
blue light of lines of code that kept their empire standing. My name is Lewis, and for 3 years I was the ghost in the machine of a startup that everyone thought was going to be the next big thing.
Empty.
They called me the code guy behind my back in private Slack channels while in public. I was just Ghost, an invisible hand fixing bugs while they took the bows. Every time I suggested a structural improvement,
Thinky.
Vicky would flash that condescending, fake sweet smile and tap my shoulder. Just keep the site running, sweetie, shed chirp, as if my only function was to be an automated server maintenance bot.
Ving.
Brett was even worse. He treated my work like a ready-made gift he'd bought off the shelf. He'd stand in front of investors, puffing out his chest.
You.
Describing complex database optimizations as if he'd personally written the logic while I was sitting 2 feet away. Literally patching the errors in his presentation. Slides in real time.
You.
I actually kept a mental tally of every time they claimed credit for my sleepless nights. I stopped counting after the 30th time. The day I realized I wasn't just an employee, I was a prop in their theater of lies.
Thinged.
Watching Brett present was like watching someone claim they'd painted the Sistine Chapel while Michelangelo was standing right there. Paint on his apron and brush still wet in his hand, but Owen, the CEO,
Ing.
was the architect of my misery. Everything was about his vision, his legacy, and his world-class team. I was a team of one, living in a studio apartment that smelled like stale pepperoni and broken dreams.
Feud.
While he talked about us like we were a sprawling corporate powerhouse, my life outside the terminal was decaying just as fast. Kristen, my girlfriend, began drifting away, always coming home late,
Rumble.
claiming she was managing some high-profile gala or event. I was too buried in server logs to see the obvious signs that everyone else, including my friend Zach, seemed to notice.
Fax would send me cryptic texts tasking.
If I'd seen Kristen at this place or that place, while I foolishly insisted she was just working hard. Then came that Friday, a night etched into my memory like acid on glass.
Finished.
The deployment early. The servers were finally stable. And I walked through my front door hoping to surprise her. Instead, I found her on the couch with a guy named Prieston,
Fijix.
moving with a rhythm that left no room for doubt. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. She just rolled her eyes with an air of profound annoyance. You're never here, Lewis, she snapped, smoothing her hair.
Pathetic startup over me every single day.
And this is exactly why Prieston and I connected. Prieston looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery, but I stopped him.
Faked it.
So you blame me for your betrayal because I was working to build a future for us, I asked, watching the sheer arrogance of her justification. She stood up tall and self-righteous, as if she were the martyr in this narrative. Freeston makes time for me, he shows up, he's successful. And he doesn't worship. A screen, she spat. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a punch. I started to laugh, a hollow, jagged sound that filled the room. You're right, Kristen,
Rem.
I said, my voice cold and steety. I do need to figure out my priorities, and you are officially at the bottom of the list. I told them to enjoy the apartment, grabbed my laptop and a duffel bag,
Fission.
and walked out the door without looking back. The look of confusion on their face, the loss of the target they wanted to hurt, was worth every second of those wasted years. I crashed at Zach's place, and the next day,
Finn was out. I cleared out my life.
Zach handed me a beer, his eyes filled with a mix of pity and fury. You gonna be okay, he asked. Eventually, I replied, staring at my laptop. Right now.
Focus on the one thing they still owe Memi equity.
Zach just shook his head, knowing exactly what was coming. Whatever you say, man, but when the whole thing blows up,
Thing you.
call me, I've got a shovel and ready to bury the evidence. He didn't know how right he was. The IPO announcement hit on a Tuesday, and the company was valued at a staggering $600 million. My 1% share,
Thumb.
the promise they'd whispered to me for 3 years, was worth $6 million. I sat there in my dark room, calculating the math, feeling a strange sense of vindication. I messaged Owen on Slack,
Things.
my heart hammering against my ribs. Hey, just wanted to finalize the equity transfer before the IPO hits. I typed dot, 3 dots appeared, hovered, and then vanished. Then they appeared again. And then,
He sent a single laughing emoji, followed by,
bro, you were never an employee. You're a 1999 contractor. No equity for contract as standard stuff. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. 3 years of 80-hour weeks, no benefits, no overtime, just a flat $55,000 a year. And he had the audacity to call it standard. Everything snapped into focus.
Buren.
I realized then that I hadn't been building a company. I had been the product they mined until the gold was gone. But they forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who built the infrastructure.
Thing.
I was the one who wrote the code that connected the entire platform, and I was the only one who knew about the kill switch. ID hard-coded during those long, lonely nights when they were busy taking credit for my genius.
Fingen.
As they prepared to go public, I opened my terminal. The cursor blinked, waiting for the command that would turn their $600 million valuation into a digital graveyard.
Justice isn't always found in a courtroom.
Sometimes. It's found in a single line of code, pressed by the man they thought was too insignificant to matter. I hit enter, and the screen went black. The party had just started for them, but for me.
Fent.
The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The office was buzzing with that artificial, hollow energy that only happens right before a disaster. Kristen looked at me with that patronizing, thickeningly sweet smile, the kind that reminded me exactly where I stood, in the pecking order, the very bottom. Every time Brett took credit for my architecture, he wasn't just stealing work. He was stripping away my dignity.
For 3 long years.
I let him, mostly because the lie was easier to swallow than the truth.
You've been played for 3 years.
Isn't just an inconvenience, it's a soul-crushing realization that you aren't the genius you thought you were. Owen, the CEO, sat at the head of the table,
Fusion.
treating the destruction of my career like a mere business transaction. The next day, the bonus announcement was held in the main office, a ritual of humiliation dressed up as corporate culture.
Fuji.
Owen walked around with a stack of envelopes, handing them out like he was bestowing a royal decree, and when he reached me, he dropped a pathetic, thin envelope on my desk. It contained a $300 check and a gift card to a local pizza joint, a slap in the face that tasted like cardboard. Owen stood at the front of the room,
Being a nauseating speech about how
everyone contributed to this massive success, his eyes sliding right over me, as if I were a piece of office furniture. Vicky, his right-hand sycophant,
Fixty.
toasted the team with a glass of cheap champagne, and Brett, like a broken record, repeated her every word 3 seconds later. I sat there, staring at that check,
Fusenet.
realizing the math of my life had been reduced to a cruel equation. 3 years of my youth, roughly 7,000 hours of unpaid overtime, yielded a bonus that didn't even cover my grocery bill.
Isn't.
I had been worth less to them than the electricity it took to keep their fragile servers running, yet there I was, surrounded by their pathetic celebratory pizza. That night,
Sleep was a luxury.
I couldn't afford my mind was a loop of Kristen telling me I was a workaholic, that I'd wasted my prime chasing a phantom dream. Then, a cold, sharp clarity washed over me,
You.
and I opened my laptop to look at the code lifeblood of their company. Every module, every critical function, every piece of logic that kept their platform from imploding it was all mine.
You.
And it was held together by nothing more than my constant invisible maintenance. They were running on technical debt, a ticking time bomb of rushed patches and sloppy shortcuts that I had been begging them to fix for years.
Fused.
Choosing short-term speed over long-term stability, and now that arrogance was going to be their undoing. The IPO was scheduled for Monday,
Function.
the grand stage where Owen would finally pancreatic attack God in front of the world. I spent the weekend documenting every penitency, every fragile integration
On every single point of failure.
that I had been papering over for years. On Sunday night, I sent a simple text to Zach. Remember that shovel you mentioned, say when? His reply was chillingly brief.
Being to be bad.
Dot. Depends on your definition of bad. I wrote back. Monday morning, I made coffee, sat on my couch, and watched CNBC as the clock ticked toward the opening bell. There was Owen,
Gross nut.
standing on the floor of the stock exchange in a suit that cost more than my first car, radiating a smug, unearned pride. The reporter asked him about their engineering excellence,
Fusin.
boasted about their best-in-class team, and innovative, world-class solutions. I laughed because I was the team, and our solutions were essentially digital duct tape, holding up a collapsing building at exactly 9:30 a.m.
Confetti fell.
The stock opened at $52, and in that same moment, I sent my resignation. A mail effective immediately. I didn't give notice. I didn't offer a transition. I simply vanished into the digital ether.
First tremors began.
Endpoints started timing out, and database queries began to crawl as if they were wading through mud. By 10:00 a.m., the cascading failures began the checkout flow. The core engine,
Towards all of it began to unravel.
with a spectacular, terrifying speed. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts,
The inevitable consequence of
every shortcut they had demanded, and every well-fix-it later lie they had told. I watched the stock ticker on my phone begin its descent. 52, 50, 48, 46.
the NBC host.
Looked visibly confused as Owen's expression shifted from triumph to pure, unadulterated panic, his phone undoubtedly lighting up with furious calls from the board. They're world-class engineers,
Fact.
the ones with the Ivy League degrees who were supposed to make me redundant, were completely lost in the wreckage. They were staring at my code, trying to decipher a map they weren't qualified to read.
Fuse while the system burnt to the ground around them. Dot.
Twitter exploded with screenshots of error codes. Tech journalists were frantic with theories of cyber warfare, and the market reacted with ruthless efficiency.
Fume.
By the time the closing bell rang, they had hemorrhaged $40 million in valuation, a massive, public failure that turned their coronation into a funeral. I turned off the television, opened my laptop,
Fenty.
and saw 17 missed calls from Owen and Vicky. The texts poured in, starting with begging for my help, moving to frantic accusations, and ending with hysterical claims that I was destroying everything they had built.
Bing.
I didn't answer a single one justice. Isn't a conversation, it's a consequence. The stock eventually stabilized once they threw enough money at consultants to perform a band-aid job, but the damage to their reputation was permanent.
Fume.
Investors were running for the exits, and the narrative had shifted from tech genius to technical incompetence. Owen started telling everyone that I was a disgruntled contractor who had sabotaged them, but he was wrong.
Binged.
I hadn't sabotaged them at all. I had simply stopped pretending that their company was anything other than what they had built. A house of cards. I poured myself a drink, toasted to the screen, and finally
For the first time in 3 years, I felt entirely, perfectly free.
This is a narrative script tailored for a high-retention YouTube storytelling channel. They told everyone I was a disgruntled,
Vint.
amateur developer who abandoned ship right before the company's biggest moment. They claimed I had sabotaged their systems on purpose, a pathetic attempt to frame me for their own catastrophic incompetence.
Here is the irony. I didn't break anything.
I simply stopped fixing the disasters they created. I stopped being the invisible ghost in the machine, the safety net for their crumbling house of cards. And let me tell you,
Thing.
watching their multi-million-dollar empire collapse in real time was the sweetest thing I have ever witnessed. My name is Lewis. For 3 years, I worked for a high-profile Silicon Valley startup. The founders, Owen and Vicky,
Of the Visionary Act.
they sold dreams of equity, IPOs, and early retirement to anyone gullible enough to listen. I was the code guy from community college to them. I was just a line item on a budget,
Spendable resource that didn't know the difference between a promise and a contract.
but they forgot one thing. I am a developer. I don't just write code, I track data. Every single day for 3 years, I took screenshots.
Feeble.
Every Slack message, every shady email, every meeting where they laughed about cheating investors and screwing over employees. I organized them all into a master folder on my private cloud. I titled it Insurance.
Tuesday night.
My friend, Zach, sat across from me on the floor, surrounded by takeout boxes and half-empty bottles. On my monitors, 3 years of my life were being laid out in a cold, hard timeline.
You're really going to trigger this, aren't you?
Zach asked, shaking his head. I didn't answer. I pointed to a specific thread from 6 months before their planned IPO. Owen had sent a message to Vicky.
If you just keep him thinking he'll get
Equity by the time we IPO, it won't matter. He's just a community college kid. He won't lawyer up. Vicky's reply was even worse. Honestly, I'm surprised how much hell do for basically nothing.
the best hire we've ever made, just don't put anything.
In writing, Brett, their golden boy manager, chimed in with, exactly, as long as he doesn't ask for a contract, we're good. Zach whistled, his face turning pale.
People aren't just greedy.
He whispered. They're stupid. They aren't stupid, I replied, my voice steady. They're just arrogant. I reached out to Casey, a veteran investigative journalist at a top-tier tech publication.
He was skeptical at first.
Everyone thinks they have a story, Lewis. She told me over the phone. Why should I trust yours? Because I have the metadata.
Fact.
The skepticism in her voice vanished once the documents arrived in her inbox. By Wednesday morning, the silence from Owen and Vicky had been replaced by a deafening roar of notifications. My phone didn't stop vibrating.
Bum started.
With hey, let's talk, moved to, you're ruining everything, and ended with we have lawyers. I didn't reply to a single word. By Thursday, the company released a public statement
Officially painted me
as a disgruntled contractor who had sabotaged their server infrastructure. My LinkedIn profile was flooded with hate. Recruiters stopped calling. My career,
Fengston.
the thing I had worked for every hour of every day for years, was being burned to the ground by people who didn't even know how to write a simple script. Then, I got a text from my ex, Kristen.
Thaw the news.
I always knew you were the problem, Preston, and I are praying for you.
Lol.
I looked at the screen, felt a cold, sharp calm wash over me, and hit the block button. I didn't care about their public image.
For the truth to hit the public.
2 weeks later, the article went live. The headline was exactly what I wanted. IPO Day, Chaos Labor Violates, and lies at startup name. Casey hadn't just used my story.
Viewed.
She had found Caleb, employee number 4. Caleb had been fired 2 weeks before the company's first major funding round because he dared to ask for the equity he was promised. Then she found 2 other developers,
Fushi.
both treated with the exact same cycle of abuse. The article hit the tech world like a shockwave, but the real twist wasn't the article itself. It was the follow-up.
Fengston.
Someone inside the company Somian who had finally had enough recorded a board meeting. In the audio, Vicky was heard laughing, calling me a bitter little man who couldn't handle the pressure. He didn't know the recording was being sent directly to Casey's inbox. The fallout was instant. Investors pulled their funding within 48 hours of the audio going public. The IPO, the big moment they had been chasing,
He was canceled indefinitely.
Owen and Vicky were forced out by the board. I didn't lose my career. In fact, I started getting calls from companies that actually value transparency. Last week,
Fished.
I saw a post on Reddit about that company. It was officially bankrupt, their systems in shambles, because the only person who knew how to keep them running was sitting on his couch watching them fall.
Justice doesn't always happen in a courtroom.
Sometimes it happens in a folder labeled insurance, and sometimes the best way to win is to simply stop playing their game sob loose, and finally done.
They say.
In Silicon Valley, you're either the disruptor or the one being disrupted. I never expected to be the one they'd try to erase from existence. 3 years of my life, thousands of hours of unpaid code,
Vigdeen.
all boiled down to a $15 million lawsuit because I dared to speak the truth. They thought I was just a tired developer who would wither away under the pressure.
When you take everything from a man, he has nothing left to fear.
It started with a whisper in a meeting. Vicky, the coup, stood there smiling that cold.
Peace.
Corporate Smiland told the entire room I was bitter. She called me unfit for a growth environment. A recording of that meeting found its way to Casey, a journalist who had been digging into the startup's messy IPO.
Victor.
Then came the public hit. Brett, the CEO, went on record saying they had given me every opportunity to succeed. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They didn't stop at character assassination.
Few.
Their legal team started firing off aggressive letters, threatening defamation suits. That was when the adrenaline turned to ice in my veins. I knew I couldn't fight this with rage alone. I needed a professional.
Found Billy Pearson.
A lawyer with a face like an old stone wall and an office that smelled of dusty law books and resolve. I walked in with boxes of evidence-to-Slack logs, emails, code timestamps.
Fade it.
Billy leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the documents. He didn't flinch. Even when I showed him the private messages from Owen the ones, where he'd promised me the moon and the stars, only to deliver a knife in the back.
Defamation threat is noise,
Billy said. But they're looking for a way to use the computer. Fraud and abuse act against you. My stomach dropped. I just resigned, Billy, I whispered. I know, he replied, his voice steady.
You.
But they lost millions on IPO Day, their wounded animals, and wounded animals bite. Billy looked at me, a flicker of something close to a smirk appearing. We aren't just going to defend you, we're going to countersue.
3 years of massive unpaid overtime
was a goldmine for us. Wage theft, fraudulent inducement, unjust enrichment. They picked the wrong developer, he said. I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe,
just maybe,
the tide was turning. The lawsuit arrived via FedEx 2 weeks later. 40 pages of legalese, demanding $15 million. I was a guy living in a studio apartment.
Wanted to ruin my entire future.
Then, the harassment started. My address leaked on a forum. Pizza deliveries I didn't order arrived at midnight.
Theme.
My landlord received calls from strangers, claiming I was running an illegal operation. It was psychological warfare. I had to move into my friend Zach's spare room, terrified every time a car pulled up on the street.
Yisham.
The hearing for their restraining order felt like a funeral for my freedom. Their lawyers painted me as a tech terrorist. Billy stood up, adjusted his tie, and presented the First Amendment argument with surgical precision. That truth wasn't defamation. The judge didn't just deny their request. To silence me, he narrowed it down so far it rendered their motion useless. I had won the right to keep talking, but the victory felt hollow.
Thanks.
I was still broke, still being hunted, and the legal bills were mounting like a tidal wave. Watching Owen on financial news shows was the hardest part. He played the victim in 5,000 suits, talking about trust and betrayal.
You.
The world was applauding his integrity while he was burning mine to the ground. I felt the weight of my parents' disappointment, the shame of being the guy who got fired and sued by a unicorn startup.
Vet.
I sat on the floor of Zach's apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had anything left to hold on to.
Dot. Month 4.
Dot. The depositions began as Billy started presenting the internal Slack logs during discovery.
Fence's confidence crumbled.
The documents didn't lie. They're messagist ones where they openly mocked the investors and plotted to hide the financial state of the company. Were now part of the public record.
Fair.
The lawyers for the startup stopped being aggressive and started being desperate. Billy turned to me during a break, his expression unreadable. They want to talk settlement, he said. They realize that if this goes to trial,
Things eat.
their stock isn't the only thing that's going to crash. It wasn't a movie ending with confetti. It was a long, brutal process that forced them to admit they had breached my contract.
For a check, they cut me.
Wasn't just for the back wages, it was enough to clear my debts and give me the fresh start I needed. I didn't become a billionaire, but I kept my integrity. I watched the news a few months later.
Fakey.
Alan and Vicky were forced out by the board as the management issues came to light. The tech industry is small, and once you have shown your true colors, even a high-priced peer firm can't hide the stain.
Fact.
I learned one thing throughout this nightmare. They rely on the fact that you'll be too scared to fight back. They bank on your silence. But when you finally find the courage to stand up,
Their power was only as big as your fear.
don't let them silence you. Justice takes time, but it's worth every single second. If you've ever had a boss try to crush your future,
You want to hear your story in the comments. You aren't alone. Subscribe for more.
the clock on the wall was mocking me, ticking away seconds that felt like hours here in France. My life had become a series of legal filings,
Sleepless nights.
and the crushing weight of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit hanging over my head. Every single day was a battle against a system that seemed designed to drain me dry. Billy, my lawyer, kept telling me to hold on.
But my bank account was screaming for mercy.
Between the mounting legal fees and the absolute impossibility of finding a job while labeled as a troublemaker in the tech world, I was drowning. Then,
First settlement offer arrived from Owen's legal team. $25,000.
that was the price they put on my dignity and the years of my life I had poured into their failing vision.
Injured.
They wanted me to sign a comprehensive NDA and vanish into the shadows for pocket change. Billy just laughed when he saw the document, his eyes narrowing as he grabbed his notepad. We weren't just going to refuse, we were going to force them to look at the reality of their own greed. We're countering with everything, he said, his voice steady. Saz, I'm adding the back pay calculations for those 90-hour weeks.
You.
The math was brutal, showing over $280,000 in unpaid overtime alone. California law was finally on my side, and we intended to make them regret every illegal shortcut they had taken. Following months were a blur of hostility, back-and-forth emails, and the constant threat of SC investigations. Their lawyer, Monica, was a master of the dance. She started with insulting lowball offers,
Vision.
then pivoted to claiming my damages were inflated. She tried to imply that we were both just reasonable people who wanted to move on, suggesting that a fight would only cost more than the payout. It was a cold,
Calculated performance.
and we both knew every single step of the routine. Meanwhile, Casey's follow-up article hit the press, exposing the rot within the tech startup culture. It didn't name me explicitly,
You.
but the industry
Does it-
knew exactly who it was about. The pressure on Owen's company was mounting, and their stock price was bleeding out. The board finally put Owen on leave,
Fiend.
a convenient arrangement where he sat at home collecting checks while his puppets. Vicky and Brett scrambled to stop the ship from sinking. Right in the middle of the chaos, a LinkedIn notification blinked on my screen.
It was Earl.
An engineering lead from a competing firm. He had seen the reports and wanted to talk about contract work. I was skeptical, but Billy told me to just keep my mouth shut and don't sign a single thing.
Thinged.
Earl met me at a local coffee shop, bypassing the drama and asking sharp, technical questions about my previous projects. He wasn't looking for a scapegoat, he was looking for a builder. For the first time in months,
Felt like a professional human being again.
The negotiations with Owen's team, however, remained a war of attrition. They offered 85,000. We countered at 375.
325.
We dropped to 325. It was like an auction in hell, with my life hanging in the balance. 6 months after the nightmare began, we finally sat down for formal mediation.
Victim.
The neutral law office felt sterile, but the tension was thick enough to cut. Their board member sat across from us, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. Billy laid out every piece of evidence, every desperate email where I warned them about the systems failing, every Slack message where they had dismissed my warnings with arrogance, the timesheets, the holiday work logs, and the cold, hard proof that I had been lied to about equity. The board member's face turned pale when he saw the records of Owen promising me shares that never existed. Monica shifted tactics, realizing the ship was taking on water.
Back.
They finally floated 185,000 with a promise of mutual silence. Billy didn't blink. He countered at 315,000.
Ephesians.
With strict language that allowed me to speak about industry practices without ever naming them. He demanded a written acknowledgement that this was a settlement, not an admission of fault on my part. They took a break, whispering in the hallway, desperate to extract one last favor, a technical handoff. Billy agreed to a limited session, documented, controlled, and final. Hours bled into more hours. Coffee cups piled up like tombstones, and the whiteboard was covered in red ink. We finally landed on $275,000. The paperwork was a nightmare of legalese, but when I finally signed, the silence in the room was deafening.
Use that.
The technical handoff happened the following week. 8 hours of watching their engineers struggle to understand the architecture I had built from scratch. One of them looked at me, genuinely humbled,
Bend.
and admitted the code was far more complex than management had ever led them to believe. I didn't brag. I just showed them how to turn off the lights. When I closed my laptop, that chapter of my life finally slammed shut.
Ease money.
The money hit my account 10 days later. After taxes and paying Billy, I was left with $165,000. It wasn't the millions I had been promised, but it was enough to breathe.
Binged.
It was enough to rent an apartment with real furniture and stop living out of a suitcase. Most importantly, it was enough to prove that I wasn't just a disposable resource. Earl kept his word, and the job offer came through. The work was clean, the boundaries were clearly defined, and my hours were actually respected. When Earl asked me to work a weekend early on, I instinctively started to say yes out of habit. Then I stopped.
I told him Monday would be better.
He just said, "Sounds good," and that was the end of it. No guilt, no passive-aggressive comments about not being a team player. Just work. Owen resigned shortly after the settlement,
Sissy.
moving on to another startup, as if nothing had ever happened.
Not.
Guys like him always land on their feet. They are masters of failing upward. But the company never quite recovered, its stock stagnating while the industry moved on.
Fusat.
I still have every piece of documentation tucked away in a safe deposit box. Not because I want to use it, but because for the first time in a long time, I finally feel in control of my own story.
Front.
The stock price finally leveled off at $38, a modest finish to a saga that had felt like a descent into madness. Everyone else seemed to simply move on, as if the chaos had been nothing more than a bad dream.
Peopled.
Billy had pulled me aside on my final day, his voice grave, and insisted that I archive every single shred of documentation I possessed. I took his advice to heart,
UAs.
renting a secure, safe deposit box to house the evidence of the company's toxicity. 4 months into my new role with Earl, he pulled me into his office, offering a contract extension and a significant raise.
Ian.
The work here was undeniably dull, a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled impossible coding marathons we used to pull at 2 in the morning. There were no midnight fires to fight, just standard development, routine code reviews,
Predictable hum of enterprise infrastructure.
but for the first time in years, I realized that boring was a blessing in disguise. Boring meant stability.
Ancient.
and stability meant I could finally reclaim my weekends without the threat of a system crash looming over my head. Recruiters began sliding into my inbox with actual, legitimate offers from established companies.
Thankenst.
I became incredibly selective, swatting away any pitch that dared to use words like disruption, equity, or changing the world. I had been down that road, survived the lawsuit, and learned the most expensive lesson of my life.
Team.
Then, 8 months after the dust had finally settled, I was sitting in a quiet coffee shop near my new apartment, minding my own business. That was when the world decided to tilt on its axis again.
Ver.
Someone pulled out the chair directly across from me, and the sound of the wooden legs scraping against the floor made me look up. It was Kristen. It was the first time I had laid eyes on her since our brutal breakup,
Feel.
and she looked fundamentally different. She seemed weary, the sharp edge of her usual confidence replaced by a hollow exhaustion. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the espresso machine.
And sure, if you'd still be coming to this place.
She shifted in her seat, looking visibly uncomfortable, as if she didn't know how to carry her own body. "I saw the news about the settlement," she continued,
Think.
her eyes darting away from mine. "I heard what they did to you, and I wanted to say I'm sorry for how everything fell apart." I didn't offer a response,
Things at him.
waiting to see where this pathetic attempt at reconciliation was going. "Preston and I broke up," she added, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Turns out,
Mew.
he was seeing—"
Other people the entire time we were together.
She let out a dry, forced laugh that sounded like glass breaking in a quiet room. I suppose I should have seen that coming from a mile away. I remained silent,
V.
watching the way her hands trembled as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she said, leaning in, her eyes attempting to project that old vulnerability. "About us.
Victi.
About how maybe I was just too hard on you when things got difficult. You were trying to build something massive, and I suppose I just didn't get it." She looked at me with those familiar eyes.
Ving.
"The ones that used to make me believe in a future I didn't deserve. Maybe we could try again." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, looking at her not as a lover, but as a stranger who had caused irreparable damage.
Izep.
I saw the woman who had cheated on me, blamed me for her own infidelity, and called me a failure while I was drowning. I remembered the cruel texts she sent during the darkest hour of my life,
Fusion.
the ones where she boasted that Preston was praying for my career to implode. Karma is a cruel mistress, but today, she was sitting right in front of me. I looked Kristen directly in the eyes and offered a polite,
Smile.
"No, Kristen, absolutely not." Her expression shifted from hope to shock in a heartbeat. "What do you mean, no? We were good once." I calmly closed my laptop,
Eel.
the click of the lid echoing like a gavel in the small space. "You cheated on me, blamed me for it, and then mocked me when I was at my absolute lowest. What in the world makes you think I'd ever want you back in my life?"
That.
she stammered, her voice rising in desperation.
I've been through a lot. And.
"Don't," I interrupted, my voice cold and steady. "This is genuinely pathetic,
Fennant.
and I don't even want to hear the rest of your script." Tears finally welled up in her eyes, a final attempt to manipulate the situation. "I made mistakes." "Yes, but you did too. You were never home."
You were always obsessed with the code.
"You're right," I replied, standing up to leave. "I did make mistakes. I trusted the wrong people, and I put my faith in the wrong partner." "You're being incredibly cruel," she spat.
Feud. The mask of remorse finally slipping off.
"No, Kristen finally being honest, and there's a world of difference between the two." I turned to walk away, then paused.
Thought occurring to me that felt like the final piece of a puzzle.
"Oh, and by the way," I turned back to face her, her face pale as a ghost. "I was going to propose to you. I had the ring and the speech ready to go.
UV.
I am so grateful that I found out exactly what kind of person you were before I made that life-altering mistake." Her breath hitched, and she looked as if the air had been vacuumed out of the room. "Really?" she whispered. "Yeah," I said, offering a final genuine nod. "Thank God. I dodged that bullet." I walked out of the coffee shop without looking back, the cool air hitting my face like a baptism. I got into my car, started the engine, bang, and drove away from the wreckage of my past. 10 months after the IPO disaster, I had a decent apartment, a stable career, and money in the bank. Life was finally peaceful.
Vowed.
That I would protect this serenity at any cost.